All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 6, Section 2, The Early Years of the Revolution. So last section, we talked about how the colonists came to the decision to declare independence, formally separating from the British Empire, and how conflict had already broken out in places like Boston between Minutemen and professional British soldiers. So Great Britain's strategy for dealing with this rebellion, as they viewed it, was to isolate New England, especially from the British perspective. New England was where really the most intense feelings of separation were held. That was where the Boston Tea Party occurred, the Boston Massacre. It's where the fighting had already broken out at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. And so, from the British perspective, they believed that that was really, New England was kind of the engine driving this independence movement. And if you take a look at a map, we'll just pretend that's Maine, we'll pretend that's Florida. And, the colonies are laid out, the southern colonies, then there are the middle colonies, and then there are the New England colonies at the very top. And so the British wanted to attack right at the middle colonies, effectively separating the New England colonies from the rest of the independence movement. In a way, you can kind of envision this. This was England's, at least, view of it, is that, it was kind of like a snake in their eyes. That's supposed to be a snake. We'll give him a little tongue, and we'll give him an eyeball too, right? And so the British believed that, New England being the center of trouble, that if they could just cut off the head of the snake, that the entire independence movement would simply just, dissipate and go away. So some of the first British attacks occurred in New York, which was, right there in the middle colonies, but also a very populated area. And initially, the British found a lot of success. The war did not go well for the American side very early on. The Battle of Long Island was a British defeat. Many of these battles, including General Washington on the Continental side, pretty much armies fighting face to face with one another or head up with one another, and the Continental side losing. New York City was captured by the British, forcing Washington once again to retreat. It served as a base for the British and really a safe haven for loyalists. So for those people that didn't agree with the independence movement, we might just say they found, we'll just say maybe found safety in New York City. And again, that was one of the most populated cities in the 13 colonies at the time, or in the United States of America at the time. George Washington and the Continental Army, we might say about George Washington, he was the leader or led the Continental Army. He had the previous military experience, but it was also important that they chose Washington because he was from the South. The colonies really wanted to put, or at this time the states, wanted to put forward a united colonial resistance and wanted to make sure that this was a united American effort and not simply just a war between, the New England colonies and Great Britain, but that all the colonies were represented, especially those ones in the South. The Continental Army, this was authorized by the Second Continental Congress, let's say by the Second Congress, to again put forward a united fighting, right? We'll just say it, a united fighting force. Before this, each individual colony had their own militia, but now with independence and this union between the colonies, the Continental Army was the army of the United States, not the army of any individual state. And for Washington, like we said very early on, experienced a number of defeats early on in New York, spent much of the war retreating, and even after that, really was hesitant to engage with the main British army because of how poorly things had gone. Instead, Washington broke conventional tactics. That is to kind of, don't follow the rule book, but try different, more risky maneuvers. And really the reason why was morale. And morale was important. Morale is fighting spirit. So even though during the course of the revolution, as long as Washington doesn't surrender, The independence movement is still alive, right? So we might just say here, this might be the strategy. And of strategy, we'll just say that independence, so again, breaking away from Britain, independence is possible as long as Washington does not surrender. So in a sense, just as long as Washington never gets caught, never gets forced to surrender, the prospect of independence still is possible. And so Washington spends much of the army on the run, you might say. But always running and always losing battles is not good for the fighting spirit. It doesn't get a lot of people to enlist in the army. It doesn't really motivate your troops to want to go out there and put their lives on the line if they just lose every single time. So by breaking conventional tactics at the Battle of Trenton and at the Battle of Princeton, the Battle of Trenton is probably the best example. This was where Washington and his men crossed the Delaware River on Christmas Eve. We'll just say at midnight to add flavor to it. At midnight. To surprise attack British forces. Many of those that were captured were Hessians. Hessians are German soldiers for hire. We also call a soldier for hire, you might be familiar with this term, mercenary. Mercenary is somebody who fights for pay. The British had used a lot of soldiers from Germany that they were paying to fight for them. And so, especially by, attacking in the winter, that was not conventional. Recall that armies usually attacked during the summer, launching surprise attacks, doing it at midnight. This was, some of the ways that Washington was being creative and scored victories, though not very significant in terms of like capturing land or cities or preserving resources. But at the very least, it was something that could be published in the newspapers, and the American side could get kind of a boost in morale or a boost in spirit. So both of these, the Battle of Trenton, we'll just mark the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton, were American victories that again used unconventional tactics, so not just two armies fighting on a battlefield, but surprise attacks, fighting during the winter, etc., etc. American victories that boosted morale. American victories that boosted morale. So on the one hand, there was a couple of reasons the Americans could celebrate, but in the whole scheme of things, the war was still going very, very poorly for the American side. In addition to New York falling to the British, Philadelphia was captured by the British. Even though the United States did not have an official capital city at the time, this was where the Congress met, right? And so the Second Continental Congress was forced to flee from Philadelphia. Never a good sign. And meanwhile, while the British occupied Philadelphia, they were throwing lavish balls and celebrating, having a good time. George Washington and his men were enduring a very harsh winter in Valley Forge. So the winter at Valley Forge, this was when Washington and his men suffered during the winter. And I believe this was 1777. 2,500 people died from, we'll say, starvation, disease, and just the cold. It's a very, very, very low point. You might say this is a low point. Hundreds of people were deserting the Continental Army each day. And it really put into contrast kind of the way that things were going, right? The British were celebrating in Philadelphia, very lavish sort of celebrations, and Washington and his men were essentially starving to death in the cold in Valley Forge, which I believe is in Pennsylvania. But here comes the most significant part of the Revolutionary War, And if there's only one thing that you remember from the Revolutionary War, at least the fighting, there's actually a lot of things you should remember from the Revolutionary War, but from the fighting itself and the battles and stuff like that, is the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga turns out to be the turning point of the war. So first of all, the Battle of Saratoga is an American victory. British troops from Canada were attempting to march south and combine forces with British troops that were already in the colonies. Americans intercepted them, defeated the British there, and that was important because of what happened in the aftermath, and that was French, number one, French recognition of independence. So we might say of Saratoga, in short, the Battle of Saratoga and the American victory at Saratoga convinced France to side with the United States. Right? Now, the French, they had a lot of scores to settle, you might say, with the British. Remember, they lost the 7 Years' War, so they wanted to get revenge. They wanted to challenge British or Great Britain's authority around the world. But it was also important that France not only get into this war just to knock Great Britain down a peg, but to actually recognize that the United States was an independent nation. Therefore, there wouldn't be any disagreement, perhaps, in the aftermath of it. The French contributed to the American war effort by sending over military support, financial support. We can just say that this was, guns and money. These were things that were especially difficult for the Americans to get their hands on, especially guns. We also might want to take note of Navy, right? The United States had really no practical Navy to speak of, at least one that couldn't challenge the British. The French had a Navy that could challenge Great Britain at the seas. And by French jumping into this war on the side of the United States, it caused Great Britain really to sort of reevaluate the bigger picture. And that is to say, well, crushing this revolution certainly is important, but, we also here in Great Britain want to worry about what France can do in Europe, what France can do in the Caribbean. The sugar colonies, recall the sugar colonies are the most profitable colonies. More so than any colonies in North America, and perhaps France challenging Britain in places like Asia or India or something like that. Individuals who came over to help the American cause, Marquis de Lafayette, he was a French military advisor, came over to the American side, helped George Washington make the Continental Army more powerful and better at fighting. And eventually other countries also jumped in. Eventually Spain jumps in as well. So by the time that the Americans were victorious at Saratoga, the complete trajectory of the war had changed. This was no longer a war just simply between Great Britain and its colonies, but it was a war that also concerned global powers such as France and Spain.